Well, thank you all. Is the screen view unobstructed? Pretty much.
Yep.
Okay.
I got a big screen.
Okay, very good. Well, I'm going to start here. This is going to be a talk primarily about our 1890 sanctuary, but with a fair amount about the early days of the church and, of course, the parish halls that have been alongside our building. But I am going to begin with what should be a familiar scene along the frieze above the in the upper gathering hall. And it depicts, that's the seal, of course, of the town of Belmont. It depicts the goddess Pomona with her cornucopia of fruit, as well as the steeple of our 1857 church, a quaint village scene and the hills beyond. But there's a critical element that is sort of obscured in this seal, and I wonder if anyone can quickly identify what it is. All right, I'm going to just jump right ahead and you will see it quite obviously.
The hill? Oh,
Hang on. Nope. Oh, come on now. There we are. Look at right by Pomona's knee, you see the railroad train. And that train, I'm sorry?
Yes.
So that train trucking along by Pomona's knee is really a critical part of the seal. There's a history of Middlesex County that was published in 1890 that put it this way: no town in New England, unless it be a railroad center, owes its existence more directly to railroad enterprise than does the town of Belmont. So I wanted to take a minute to explain what this means. And for that, we're going to switch to an 1850 atlas of Middlesex County. We'll see that Belmont is really defined, it's not labeled, but by two hills. To the southeast, we have a hill that has been known over time as Pequasset Hill or Strawberry Hill or Meeting House Hill. That's the one that culminates at the Oakley Country Club. And then to the northwest, you see labeled quite clearly here, Wellington Hill. And in the middle, there is a fairly flat vale that runs in between, and the water flows one way toward the Mystic River to the right, and another way toward the Charles River to the left. And it was into this vale that the Fitchburg Railroad was laid in 1843. Now you look at this map, and it becomes clear that the point in the middle, where the three towns come together, that's where they put the Wellington Hill stop, and it was really remote from the centers of our three surrounding communities, Watertown, Waltham, and West Cambridge, what's today Arlington. And quite naturally, once there was a railroad stop, a rail depot, life and commercial activity sprang up, and the residents of that area, many of whom were wealthy, influential, and impatient types, were energized to seek to form their own municipality so they could control their affairs instead of being controlled by these distant towns. So our neighboring towns resisted for years, arguing that we couldn't be our own town because we didn't even have our own church. So largely to take away that objection, in February of 1856, our founders officially founded the Belmont Congregational Society Unitarian. For a year or so, the families of our founding generation met in the upstairs room of the Adams General Store, which is located where the old light plant building sits today opposite Town Hall. This watercolor you may have seen outside the Claflin room of the Belmont Historical Society in the soon-to-be Old Town Library that's coming down, so I hope it finds a prominent place in the new library. The congregation quickly set about to build a permanent church home that would open the following year. And in this next slide, we see the famous 1857 sketch by Winslow Homer that is the first depiction that I think exists anywhere that shows our church. Now in my screen, my own image is obscuring it, but do you see the steeple on the right-hand side? Oh yes, yeah, there it is. So this was published in a magazine called Ballou's Pictorial Drawing Room Companion, which was sort of a life magazine of its time that was published out of Boston. It's, as I said, the first image. There are very few, but I'm going to show you a couple of others. There are two very beautiful murals in the Claflin room of the Historical Society that were painted around 1970 by Nelson Chase, an architect. And Victoria Haas, the head of the Historical Society, tells me that he was an architect and he took care to depict the town's early buildings accurately. And he would have based it both on photographs and also on the living historical memory of older residents at the time. So think of it, 1970, you might still have some older residents who would remember a church building that lasted until 1890. So this idyllic, if perhaps somewhat idealized view, is toward the northwest, more or less from the same perspective as Winslow Homer. And then in the opposite direction, here we're looking down from Lower Concord Avenue toward Fresh Pond in the distance. The old Wellington Tavern is in the foreground. It's been replaced by the town hall. And at the far right, you see the Adams store, and moving progressively left, you see the old Wellington Hill train station that we have outside the church, an outbound steam train, and then just to the left of the train, you can see our church building. Now I'm going to take a close-up view and compare these images with the only known photograph that really features our building. I found one other where it's in the background. Our past historians, and Jim, this includes certainly your book, describe this building as being of Carpenter Gothic style. I looked up in the Britannica, Encyclopedia Britannica, that term is defined as an eclectic and naive use of the most superficial and obvious motifs of Gothic decoration. So think of it as Gothic cut in wood with jigsaws rather than carved in stone by masons. The building, to me, more or less resembles a barn with pointed arch windows and a picturesque steeple that's stuck on the front to signal that it's a church. But to be honest, it was not very well built. It needed frequent repairs. And before too long, there were calls to have it replaced. Now I'm going to explore a couple of other maps. We don't have other pictures, but we do have this map from the 1875 Middlesex County Atlas that shows our church wedged between Concord Avenue and the railroad tracks with a Unitarian parsonage across the street. Now that would not be our Johnson house, but rather a similar house on the parking area of the minister's home of our neighbor, the First Armenian Church. You also note on the upper left, there were several homes on the higher west side of Pleasant Street, but none on the lower east side, which was still farmland at that time. And now we're going to jump to 1889, the date of this map from the next county atlas, and you'll see that a great deal has changed. And actually, that year is a unique moment when both the old church and the new church are standing. You see our church labeled S facing Belmont Park or the town green, and the old church labeled H stands next to a new expanded Fitchburg Railroad station on the inbound side. We can see the town hall has been built, and there's a cluster of about a dozen homes in the area that will become the Leonard Street shopping district. Our parsonage has been sold to someone named Otis Simons, I don't know anything about him, to help raise money for the new church. And in between, you can see a couple of lots that were acquired by J.V. Fletcher. Jonathan Varnum Fletcher was a prominent and wealthy church member and a community leader who also served as the first state senator from Belmont. And it was Fletcher who engineered and financed a land swap to acquire the site for our new building at 404 Concord Avenue and offset the expense by the sale of the lot where the old church stood. And then one night in February 1890, as the new church dedication was approaching, the old Carpenter Gothic church burned to the ground, and virtually nothing survived the blaze except for the bell and a silver bowl that we looked at on Sunday that was given to us by the ladies of the West Cambridge Unitarian Church upon our founding in 1857. Now here's a treasure from the archives. It's the program for the April 1890 service of dedication. Our minister, Hilary Bygrave, published an article in the Belmont newspaper detailing the service, and in it, he describes the new church as being one of Greater Boston's very finest. And I'm going to share now a couple of other views of the church. Here is one taken from Belmont Park, familiar perspective, and it gives a clear sense of the physical setting of the church and the town green at that time, probably late 1890s, early 1900s. And then this one will be familiar to many of you. It clearly displays the original, I think, very wonderful muscular stone archway entrance. The whole lower story of the church was fashioned from large boulders that were gathered and donated by Belmont townspeople from their fields. And we're going to be returning to talk about that beautiful entrance a bit later on. Now, 1900 marks a pivotal phase in the history of Belmont because automobiles are beginning to appear. Up until then, the city of Boston had been spreading out into nearby streetcar suburbs. Think of Dorchester, Brookline, Cambridge. But Belmont was a ring beyond and still a rural agricultural market gardening town, one of the most important sources of vegetables to the city. This is a 1900 era view, a mural located in the town clerk's office that you may have seen. And you can see a bustling center with the new town hall, the library, the high school, the rail stations, and a bit of a chaotic traffic pattern that will soon be altered by the construction of the railroad bridge and a rail station, which took place in 1907 and 08. And right in the middle of the scene, you see the beautiful old Tudor block, which we unfortunately lost to the wrecking ball in the late 60s. The Tudor block was actually quite important to our church because we were quite space constrained by the late aughts and the 19-teens. And so we rented space upstairs in that building for church school and other events. And now we're going to look at a view from the Historical Society's collection. We're looking in the other direction toward our church on a winter's day. And we're clearly at grade level. So this has to have been taken before the construction of the railroad bridge, which was probably in the early 1900s. At this point, I'd like to take us inside the building, and we'll get a couple of views, first in the sanctuary and then in the parlor. If you study this picture, you can see several differences compared to our current layout. So I'm going to mention 7 that I can spot. First off, there's wainscoting instead of paneling in the chancel. You see there's a center lectern instead of a pulpit and lectern arrangement. To the left of the chancel, you see there's a doorway, and that went into a minister's study. And the 2 plaques, I can't really see in the detail. I think those may be the plaques that were later relocated to the back of the church, honoring 2 of our earliest ministers. There's no evidence of the medallion above the center arch of the chancel. And you can see there are gas lamps that are fed by tubes coming out of the mouths of the beasts on these wonderful supports for the wood ceiling. So that's 7. Oh, and you see the smaller organ on the right-hand side. That's where the choir actually sat as well at that time, a much smaller choir. And now we'll look at this picture from the parlor. I can spot 4 major differences. There's the portrait, that's Ivory Waterhouse, one of our early ministers. The hearth of the chimney is clearly different than it is today. If you look at the glass paneling into the sanctuary, clearly those are not retractable doors as we have today. So at some point that arrangement must have been altered. I don't know quite, I can't visualize how these would have been opened to provide space directly into the church. They may have just lifted halfway. It's hard to tell. And then you can see there are frames on either side of the fireplace. On the left is that wonderful quote by Edward Everett Hale, look out, not down, lend a hand. That is still in our conference room today. Now let's take a look at another scene that's probably about a decade later. The cars have begun to appear, and clearly from this perspective, we're looking at our church from the railway overpass. Enough time has gone by that there's ivy growing on the stone boulder walls, and Belmont, with the appearance of cars, enters its most dramatic period of growth. It was during the 1920s that at one point, Belmont was actually described as the fastest growing community in America. So really a very dramatic period of change for the town, for the church. We were outgrowing our limited space. And so it was in the teens and then the early 20s that pressure grew to expand the church. And now we're going to talk about I think some real treasures in our archives. There's a set of lantern slides that depicted the plans for the new building. Actually, a couple of plans. I'm going to show the plans for the building design that was selected with relatively few changes. I don't think we never ended up with the chimney and fireplace hearth that is shown here above the parish house door. But here's the facade that is, I'm sure, familiar to attendees here who remember the church from 20 plus years ago. The next image will show us the ground plan. So there was a circular drive surrounding the church that was then expanded to encircle the new parish house. And moving on, we're going to look at a scene of the original vision for the auditorium in the parish hall. We didn't end up with that splendid ceiling. It was a somewhat modified design, but that's quite a striking drawing, I think. And it was a charming, attractive building. Certainly at the time that it was built, the Belmont Church was the envy of many surrounding church congregations. Now we have the two floor plans. This shows the basement level, and you'll recall there was an auditorium where we used to have the musicals and other events. And you see there was not only a real rabbit warren of small classrooms, but also a number of staircases throughout. And accessibility, as we'll recall, was always an issue. I remember before the building was taken down, realizing we had 9 distinct levels that had to be accessed by climbing up or down stairs. So it was a bit of a nightmare from an accessibility standpoint. You see the central kitchen, the door into the basement, and then this area labeled banquet hall, but would later be modified into Dawes Hall. And the coal heating system required fully 1/3 of the basement level, not only for coal storage and a very large boiler, but also an air hoist outside the turret there and a heating chamber down at the bottom. So keeping this place warm was real estate intensive. What we now call the Tinkham room in the upper left corner was the kitchen, and there was a dumbwaiter allowing food to be hoisted upstairs. Now let's take a look at the upstairs, and we see there are classrooms in the parish hall, but on the left-hand side, it's interesting to see how the church was designed originally in the 1890s. You can see several differences from today. For example, at the entrance, there was a shallow porch and then a somewhat smaller vestibule. To the left, the minister's study was then labeled parlor, and the parlor was then labeled vestry, and you see serving room in the upper corner, what later became, we remember, as Susan Street's office, where the business of the church was concentrated. And if you've ever wondered about that row of small windows that you can see from our parking lot on the east side of the church, this plan shows that there was a minister's room just off the chancel with its own small private bathroom, and a passage behind the hearth of the parlor, so the minister could come and go unobtrusively. It's quite interesting. If you want to spend a little more time studying this, you can do so and look at the recording and actually stop on these slides. Now we're going to look at an image of how an artist envisioned that building would actually look, as designed by William Cox, a Boston architect. And let's compare this to a photograph that was included in the 75th anniversary history prepared by our minister, Henry Wilder Foote. Quite faithful to the original design. So this was completed in 1924. Belmont was on a tear. Our church was growing robustly. And a few years later, there would be yet another major project. It was in 1926 that Edwin Atkins died. He had been our longtime parish committee chairman and benefactor. And you'll recall we talked extensively about the Atkins family and the Atkins window at the February presentations last year. A few years later, in 1929, his widow Catherine offered the gift of a magnificent new Cassavant Frere organ, which became available when a large theater project failed. But the organ was offered for free, provided that the church could raise funds for the cost of adapting the sanctuary to fit a quite large instrument into a fairly modest space. And this flyer is the fundraising appeal that was sent out to members. The timing of the appeal was unfortunate because a good deal of the work had been completed with borrowed money. And then Black Tuesday hit in October of 1929, and the country would soon sink into the Great Depression. And the church's finances were left in really quite a precarious condition for a number of years, through the 30s. And then we had the war, of course. So there would not be any more ambitious projects for a full quarter century. But this project was completed. And the last picture image I want to look at before we take a break is of the sanctuary before and after. So we've looked at the picture on the left, and as you compare it with the image on the right, which is from the not quite the same vantage point, what are the most notable differences? Well, I think most prominently, we see the cross on the altar hanging behind the chancel table, which was an entirely new arrangement and really made our sanctuary look much more like a mainstream Christian church. I think if you walked into a Methodist, Presbyterian, Episcopal church of that era, you might have seen a similar scene. There's a pulpit with a traditional octagonal front to the left, and the lectern has been moved to the right. And now there's a set of stairs going up the middle. And then we see this large oculus above the center arch with the prominent cross, this open grill work that gives voice to the huge pipes of the new organ. And then finally, you see the paneling that has replaced the wainscoting in the sanctuary. This would be a convenient point if we have any burning questions. Why don't we take a pause and see if there are comments or questions before I proceed into the post-war era.
John, is there anything that details the discussion of adding the cross in particular? I mean, so at the chancel, and then the large detail, you say that was there to accommodate the organ, but is there any parish notes about the decision to add the cross?
Not that I've seen, but I've been through annual reports. I confess I haven't scrutinized all of the parish committee meeting notes from that time to see if there might be clues. I think there may have been design input from our minister, Henry Wilder Foote, of course. Although he was, I mean, he was an avowed Unitarian, but you recall that Unitarianism had more of a Christian perspective in the 19th century and early 20th century. So very interesting question, and that's an answer worth finding out.
John, how about the fact that in the ocular, the cross is really not just a cross, it's a tree of life.
That is certainly another way of looking at it. Absolutely. But I know over the years I've heard people say there are 24 crosses or something in our sanctuary. I think it's an inescapable part of the fabric and the heritage of our church. But we don't see other religious symbols. The cross is the dominant symbol for sure. All right.
If you're talking, you need to unmute yourself. You're muted right now.
I'm sorry.
Okay, now I got it.
Okay.
One major change, and I can't remember the exact date, maybe 26, when the gas lighting was replaced with electricity.
Yes, that I believe was in 26, 27, right in that time frame. Jim, you're correct. Shall we plunge forward and get into the post-war era? I mentioned the church's finances were fairly precarious through the war years, but then in 1949, the national economy was recovering. The Belmont was growing still like gangbusters. The baby boom was in full swing, and the church called a dynamic new minister named John Nichols Booth. We talked about him a bit in past years. He was not only a superb preacher and a world traveler, an author of several books, and a real genuine magician who was contractually obligated not to practice magic shows within 100 miles of Belmont during his ministry. He was also a prolific photographer. And in 1951, he compiled a slideshow about the church that is a real time capsule and a treasure of our archive. I'll be sharing about 6 or 8 pictures from that slideshow. I think there's probably 50 in all. And the ones that focus on the physical appearance of the church at that time. So here we are looking at our church exterior from the northwest with the old porch surrounded by those boulders still there. And note the size of the copper beech tree in the foreground that is now sadly reaching the end of its life. Now here is a view of the west facade of the old parish hall as it appeared at the time with the old circular driveway. And going inside, we have a view of the sanctuary as it was decorated for the annual Christmas pageant, a pageant that followed a script prepared by our own Henry Wilder Foote, and that was used by several churches nationally. That color, the green tint of the sanctuary walls, has been described as Caen stone, C-A-E-N, the northern French city that has several great Norman churches. And another view of the sanctuary, in 1951, we see that large prominent cross with the background altar cloth has been removed and replaced with a much more modest scale brass cross. And that symbol would be removed in the late 1950s during the ministry of Arthur Tripp, as the church's religious identity and our denomination's religious identity continued to evolve. Now we'll move up into the choir loft, and you can see it's a rather cramped scene with the file cabinet and the bookcase in back and the coat hooks and about 14 or 15 choristers. In recent years, we've had as many as 24 voices up there, so it does get a bit crowded, but we've opened up some of the space that was not available at this time. And now let's go down into the rather dank basement in the early 50s. Enrollment in the church school was surging. There were more than 200 students enrolled, and the church had to use every available space, including what would become Dawes Hall, and what was labeled a banquet hall in those old lantern slides. The first renovation would be in the mid-50s, and then it would be updated in the 1980s. Now we'll move into a room upstairs in the parish hall. I think, and others may have a memory of this as well, I think this is the room directly at the head of the stairs that was later used as the nursery, but it did double duty both as a classroom for the younger children and as a chapel for the children. And now we'll look downstairs in the old parish hall and see a typical church supper scene. The tables are different, the chairs, the tableware, the clothing and the headgear on many, if not most of the women. But we still have scenes like this from time to time in our new parish hall. And now we'll shift into the parlor where the youth group would meet. At that time, it was known as the Channing Club. And you can note that the mantle portrait of Ivory Waterhouse has been replaced by a mirror, but the original hearth from 1890 is still there. And also the double hung leaded glass windows are original from 1890. I haven't ascertained, and possibly Jim may know or others may know, when the bright new clear glass windows were installed. I think probably in the 70s or 80s, but we'll find that out. And now we'll take a look inside the minister's study to look at a meeting of the parish committee. At the desk, you see Amos Taylor, who served as the clerk of the church for about 35 years. And he's the individual responsible for assembling the dozen-odd leather binders of records that we have in the history cabinet that chronicle our first century. I mentioned we go back to the doorway, and the centennial was marked not only by a huge celebration in February of 1956, but also the first major capital fund drive in a quarter century. The money was used to freshen up the building, to renovate the basement into Dawes Hall, and also to modernize the entrance. When you look at this beautiful boulder-lined entrance with the shallow porch, we can see it was picturesque, but it was not completely functional. The problem is obvious here with the icicles dangling down like the sword of Damocles overhead and the snowy, slippery steps underneath. So a safer solution was needed. And in 1955 or so, a large new exterior porch was added. And the small porch area from the original church was incorporated into a larger interior vestibule, the space that we now pass through. The ramp in this image was a later addition, and others on the call may remember, perhaps from the 70s. I know it was renovated in the 90s to meet modern code requirements. And if Lanier were here, or Jim, you may know the exact date of when the ramp was updated. All in all, as we talk about the centennial of 1956, it was another period of very dynamic growth and renewal, both for the church and for the physical fabric of our building. But I think the records is clear that this period ended soon after Booth left the church in 1957. He became minister of the second church in Boston, out at Audubon Circle. And the church entered another period of about 20 years that I think we can only describe as there was some turmoil, there was a bit of stasis and decline in the church, but most of all, in terms of this presentation, there were not significant improvements in the physical plant, and there was a good deal of deferred maintenance. Now, that period would then culminate in the late 70s and 80s with a new era of energy and growth. Marjorie Sams arrived as our first woman serving as senior minister in 1977, and then Diane Miller in 81. And the church was really on fire for several years with a great deal of activity and growth. And it began to tax our physical facilities. One of the strategies for handling this growth was to renovate Dawes Hall to create additional classroom space. I have yet to come across many large-scale photos. What I'm showing here are enlargements, digital enlargements from a contact sheet of pictures that were taken by Dave Twitchell. And they give a reasonably good sense of that physical space underneath the sanctuary. Dawes Hall covered about 3/4 or so of the area under the sanctuary, and on the edge along the sides we had a couple of quite small classrooms. We had 1 or 2 offices, meeting rooms, the Tinkham room, and then the boiler room. That entire space is now mostly occupied by our restrooms and by the downstairs hallway. But beyond Dawes Hall, in order to accommodate growth, the church soon introduced double services in the early 90s. And again, I think you on this call will recall the date, either 92 or 93. But it was clear that we needed more space, and that the aging 1924 parish hall, with all of its accessibility problems and a rather obsolete kitchen, was going to need replacement. And that is what brought us to the decision to construct our beautiful new parish hall and religious education wing, a project that was completed in 2004. Now, I'm approaching the present day, and historians have to be careful about talking about the present. So I'm going to kind of wind up in the next few slides, not focus in detail on the new building, which we are very familiar with, but leave us with a few parting images of what went before. Here's a panorama that I took from my vantage point with the choir up in the loft. There's Victor Carpenter seated up in the chancel. It's toward the very end of his time with us in 2002. And what strikes me is I remember the bright white light flooding the sanctuary coming in those southern windows on a Sunday morning. Now, with the new parish hall, we get a moodier sense of light with the colored light filtered through the stained glass windows at either end of the space. So it's a different feel from the church prior to the construction of the new hall. And then there's one more scene from the old parish hall. I'm sure we have plenty of pictures that we can add to the archive collection to give a fuller sense of the hall. This was Alpha rehearsing us in 02 when Joseph and the Technicolor Dreamcoat was in preparation. I've counted 5 familiar faces in the choir that still sing with me on Sundays. And it was in June of 03 that we had the groundbreaking for the new building. So I'll just share a few pictures. Here we are, the Linden Singers with Alpha, Scott Ferson, our head of our parish committee or parish board at the time, and John Nichols, the interim minister at the time we embarked on the building project. A few other pictures. Here are some of the key people from the church staff. Nanny and Christine Albright, who were leaders of the Capitol Drive, Paul and Ann, who were such generous supporters of the drive, critical to its success, and Victor, of course. And I see that looks like ML behind Nanny. So we're the leaders of the church community. And then here are some of the familiar faces of the folks who led the building effort, the building committee. And just to remind us of some of our dear departed, I'm very glad to have caught this view of, we have Elena Ivaska, and I believe that's Dottie Young and Diana Waldvogel, and of course Laura Miller, who I think may be the only one of the 4 who was born after the new building, after the old building was built in 1924, or she was born right around then. And then moving from our oldest generation to our younger generation, a view of the children of that era. So all of whom probably now are in their 30s. I'm going to take us around to the other side just for one quick look at the scene in the parking lot when the foundation was set for the new building. And then there's on the right a view of the new parish hall when it was completed. And in the fall of '04, we moved back in. Jim, this is, I know, one of your pictures. It's one of my very favorite, and one we continue to use quite often, of our new enlarged home in the heart of Belmont. And then finally, this last scene, again, Jim, let's credit you with the picture on the right. I don't know if you were aware when you took it that you were standing virtually on the same spot as the photographer in the older picture. These scenes are about 100 years apart. And I will just close by expressing the hope that 100 years from now, the First Church continues to be as lively and energizing a presence here on the town common in the heart of the community of Belmont. So that is the end of my prepared presentation, and I'd love to entertain any questions or hear comments.
I think you've stunned them, John. They don't know what to say.
I'm curious about the ramp, because at one point I thought that might have been removed, because there are pictures of, I actually have a triptych that I'm so happy that I have from Eric Almquist that shows the Lions Club in Wellington Station and the church. And at one point that the whole entire entranceway was enveloped in shrubbery. And so I'm thinking at one point, I'm wondering if that ramp was completely removed. And then we came back with a new one. But
yes, I think you're right, Jean. It was originally built, and then it was found a short time later that it didn't meet code and it needed to be removed and rebuilt.
That ramp was an anonymous gift, but I'm going to tell you who it came from now. From the widow of Dr. Edwin Land of Polaroid.
Well,
In honor of the fellow's name I can't remember right now, who was a prominent member of our church and was the head of HR for Polaroid and was the number 8 employee of that company.
Oh, right. Oh,
And
I remember.
I was working at Polaroid at that time, and all of the senior staff were present, the executives. But Dr. Land himself was in a hospital at that time and didn't last very much longer.
Jean, I'd love to have maybe if I could borrow that triptych and scan it, you could certainly add that to the archive and enrich the story.
yeah, I mean, it's quite, it's a large framed, but I don't know how you could do it, but, or I'm sure Nanny's got the individual pictures because I actually got it at an auction. It's probably 4 feet, long and a long time, was above of our bed in our bedroom for a long time, but I still have it.
Great, or simply take a picture of it would be good. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll take a picture of it.
Sure.
Thank you, John. That was wonderful. I learned so much.
Oh, good. Well, thank you, Mary, for joining.
I particularly enjoyed the early part because I didn't know much of the history of Belmont. So it was fascinating to watch how we grew and how the town changed. And it's still such a thriving place.
Well, I actually am a native Belmontian. My family lived in Belmont in the 50s, but we moved away before I was 2.
Oh, wow.
And I've always thought of Belmont as being a relatively mature, built-out community. And I think we were here in town and moved back to Belmont with Teresa and our children into what is really a pretty fully built-out community. But if you were here 100 years ago, 120 years ago, it must have been incredibly dramatic to see the changes year to year. in this place. You know, it really was a leading agricultural center. At one time in the late 19th century, the largest greenhouses in America were here in Belmont. So we were a very important market garden center.
Yeah, I have, as I had mentioned on Sunday, I have one of my neighbors got a hold of an aerial photograph of the part of Belmont where we live. And I was amazed to see that in that very built up area to the south of the Mary Burbank School, there were no houses, but there were these gigantic greenhouses, a pair of them that, you know, seemed to run from sea to shining sea, basically.
Yeah, yeah.
Not
Well,
quite.
on the farming note, the first Holstein cows, I think they came from the Netherlands, showed up in Belmont, up where the golf course is now.
John, do you know if Dorothy Stoneman has any pictures from her days as a youth?
Well, interestingly, I was just up visiting with her, and a lot of memories, but she did not mention any pictures. I'll go to her again. I had a wonderful 2.5-hour lunch with Dorothy just 2 weeks ago, so I'll ask if she has anything that she would be able to contribute. I've got to believe there are other treasures in people's photo albums and attics that we could turn up to help tell this story. But we do have a lot of wonderful material, and the Town Historical Society files have also been an important source.
Well, thank you. Mary, you're gonna need to unmute. Mary, you need to unmute. You're muted.
Sorry, I know we have to go. I noticed on about the third slide you showed, a third or fourth map, and it was kind of a yellowish background. Not that that particularly helps, but it had the name something W Homer, and I was wondering if that's Winslow Homer. And
Winslow Homer, who was the artist of that sketch looking across the town. Was that what you were mentioning?
I was wondering if that is the Winslow Homer.
It is indeed. Yeah, he spent summers here in Belmont as a young man. His uncle was quite wealthy, lived in the house that's now the Belmont Women's Club. So several of Homer's, actually some of his most famous paintings were here in Belmont. The painting of the two boys in the field was up where the Belmont, up where the club is on the top of Concord Avenue.
Yes, thank you. All right, thank you so much, John.
Well, thank you, John. It's been an incredible presentation, and I'm glad that we have recorded it. I'm going to stop the recording now.